The cabin smelled like recycled air and expensive cologne, that particular blend of leather seats, industrial cleaner, and the faint ghost of 100 previous passengers that I had learned to stop noticing after my first year on the job. 3 years of working transatlantic routes had a way of filing down your senses, until airports felt more like home than any apartment you'd ever rented, and strangers felt safer than anyone you'd ever loved. I liked it that way. I smoothed the front of my navy uniform jacket in the small mirror tucked inside the galley door, checking that my hair was properly pinned, that the small gold wings on my lapel sat level. Elena Marsh, the badge read. Not the name I was born with. Not the name I had carried for 2 years of a marriage that nearly destroyed me. Just Elena Marsh, a woman with a clean employment record, a modest apartment in Dublin, and absolutely no traceable past beyond 4 years ago. I had built that invisibility deliberately, the way you build a wall, one careful brick at a time. Elena, we're boarding in 10. Carla, my senior colleague, leaned her head through the galley curtain, her red lipstick immaculate as ever. She had the kind of cheerful efficiency that I genuinely admired, the sort that didn't require anything painful underneath it. Ready, I said, and I meant it. Flight DL 447, Dublin to New York, full cabin. Business class sold out entirely, which meant the next 8 hours would keep me moving. Drink requests, meal services, the careful choreography of attending to people who preferred not to acknowledge that you were a person at all. That was fine. Invisibility in both directions suited me perfectly. The economy passengers boarded first. The usual river of wheeled luggage and tired eyes. Families negotiating overhead bins. Businessmen already pulling laptops from bags before they'd even found their seats. I smiled at each one. I handed out blankets and pointed toward lavatories. I was good at this, at the performance of warmth without the vulnerability of it. Then business class began boarding, and I moved to the forward galley. I didn't see him immediately. That was the thing I would return to afterward, in the sleepless hours between Dublin and whatever city I'd be waking up in. The fact that I didn't feel it before I saw him. I had always imagined, in my more dramatic private moments, that I would sense it, that some animal part of me would sound an alarm. 4 years of running, and I'd somehow convinced myself that I would have warning. I was arranging the pre-departure champagne flutes when I heard the shift in the cabin's atmosphere, rather than saw it. A particular quality of quiet that moved through the boarding passengers like a current, the way a school of fish parts for something larger. The flight attendant near the door, young, first year, still startled by things, straightened almost imperceptibly. I turned. He was standing at the entrance to the jetway, speaking in low tones to the man beside him. Broad-shouldered, with the particular blankness of expression that I recognized immediately as professional security, the kind of man whose job was to be invisible, so that someone else could be visible instead. And Luca Vitano was very, very visible. 4 years. He was 34 now, which meant the angles of him had only sharpened. The jaw, the cheekbones, the quality of stillness he carried like a second skin. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the collar of a dark shirt open at the throat, and he moved through the cabin door with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life been made to wait for anything. My hand closed around the stem of a champagne flute, hard enough that I felt it in my knuckles. He won't recognize you. The voice in my head was calm, practiced. I had rehearsed this moment in theory, the way you rehearse fire drills. Different hair, different name, contacts instead of glasses, 4 years of deliberate change. You are Elena Marsh. You have never seen this man before. He was in seat 2A. Of course he was. Window seat, front row, the prime position that his organization's travel coordinator would have secured without being asked. The security man, I was already cataloging him, old instincts firing despite my terror, settled into 2C across the aisle, and a second man I hadn't noticed took the seat directly behind. 3 of them, at minimum. Probably more in economy. I turned back to the galley and breathed. He didn't look at you. He doesn't know. Do your job. The boarding completed. The safety demonstration proceeded. I moved through it with the muscle memory of 300 flights, pointing at exits, demonstrating seatbelts, my voice carrying the right notes of professional pleasantness. I did not look at row 2. I looked at every other row in the cabin with extraordinary attention. But I did not look at row 2. Takeoff came and went. The seatbelt sign extinguished. The cabin began to breathe again with the particular relaxation of passengers accepting that they were, in fact, airborne. I took drink orders from the rear of business class forward, working methodically, maintaining the careful math of my position. Always behind him, never in his sight line, moving efficiently enough that any moment I was in his peripheral vision was brief. It was working. It was going to work. 8 hours and we'd land at JFK and he would walk off this aircraft and disappear into a car that was undoubtedly already waiting at the curb, and I would breathe again. Miss. The voice hit me somewhere below conscious thought. A physical response, the way a body responds to sudden cold. My pen stopped moving against my order pad. A half second. Less. I turned. He wasn't looking at me. That was the first thing I registered. He was looking out the window at the dark Atlantic, his profile cut clean against the faint glow of the wing lights, and he had spoken with the automatic authority of someone accustomed to being responded to without needing to perform the request. "Sparkling water," he said. "No ice, no ice." He'd always hated ice in cold drinks. Called it a dilution. An American affectation. I had teased him about it once, in a different life, in a kitchen that smelled like espresso and the fresh basil he kept on the windowsill despite having no business keeping anything alive. "Of course," I said, and my voice came out clean. Professional. Belonging to Elena Marsh. He turned then. Not all the way. Not with any urgency. The slow turn of a man who controls the pace of every interaction he enters, who has never needed to rush toward anything because everything eventually comes to him. His dark eyes moved to my face with a quality of assessment so thorough it felt like hands on my skin. I held still. I was good at holding still. I had practiced it. Something moved across his expression. Too fast, too controlled for me to name. And then his eyes dropped back to the window. "Thank you," he said. I walked back to the galley. I poured sparkling water. My hands were perfectly steady, and I hated them for it, because the steadiness was the only thing standing between me and the complete unraveling of 4 years of careful, costly survival. I brought him the water. I set it on the tray table without leaning close, without lingering, without committing any of the small errors that memory might make. He didn't look up. I returned to the galley, pulled the curtain, and stood in the small aluminum space with my back against the cold wall, counting my own heartbeats the way I'd learned in the very worst months after I'd run. Measuring them, proving I was still here, still intact, still free. 40 minutes later, Carla touched my arm with a small frown. "Elena, seat 2A is asking for you specifically." The water glass. I saw it before I reached him, turned over on its tray table, the sparkling water spreading in a slow pool across the surface, dripping over the edge onto the dark carpet below. His laptop was open, pushed back just in time. A drop of water had caught the sleeve of his jacket. It hadn't been there 40 minutes ago. The glass had been upright and half full. He looked up at me as I approached, and this time, there was nothing ambiguous in his expression. The control was still there, impeccable, immovable. But beneath it, in the particular way he watched me cross the distance between us, was something I recognized from 2 years of marriage and 4 years of nightmares. He knew. "I'm so sorry," I said, reaching for the spilled glass with hands that had decided on their own to shake. "I'll get something to clean, Elena," he said. Just that. My name. The wrong name, the safe name, the name I had chosen like armor, and something in the way he said it made it sound like he'd always known it. Like he'd been waiting, patient as stone, to say it in exactly this moment, in exactly this tone. The aircraft hummed around us. 30,000 feet. Nowhere to go. I had a strategy for crises. I had developed it carefully over 4 years of being a person who could not afford to fall apart, a sequence of small, executable actions that moved you through the moment before the moment could swallow you whole. Breathe. Focus on the immediate physical task. Say only what is necessary. Move. I pressed the linen napkin against the spilled water with both hands, keeping my eyes on the tray table, on the spreading damp, on the entirely manageable problem of a spilled glass, rather than the entirely unmanageable problem of the man watching me do it. "These things happen," I said, and my voice belonged to Elena Marsh, flight attendant. 3 years Dublin-based, no prior history. "I'll bring fresh napkins and have this sorted in a moment. Sit down, Mara." The name landed like a physical thing, my real name. The name only 4 people on Earth still knew. And 2 of them were dead, and one of them was my sister, who had been sworn to silence in a conversation that had cost us both more than I could calculate. And now Luca, who sat in seat 2A with his ruined jacket sleeve and his dark, patient eyes, watching me pretend that the name meant nothing. "I think you may have me confused with someone," I said pleasantly. I straightened. I reached for the wet napkin with professional efficiency. "I'll bring fresh—" His hand closed around my wrist. Not roughly. That was the thing about Luca Vitano that no one who hadn't lived inside his orbit would ever understand. He was never rough. Roughness was for men who needed to prove something, who operated from fear or anger, who hadn't yet learned that real power expressed itself in the opposite register entirely. His grip was gentle, almost careful, and completely immovable. "The scar," he said quietly. "Inside of your left wrist. You got it helping me move a broken picture frame the week we moved into the Palermo house. You called me irresponsible for not wearing gloves. You were right. The scar was small, a thin white line, 2 centimeters, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I had looked at it every day for 4 years and thought about covering it, tattooing over it, doing something to erase it, and I had never quite managed to." The man in 2C had not moved, but I felt his attention sharpen the way you feel weather change. I looked at Luca's face for the first time, without the protection of pretending I wasn't looking at him. He was the same. That was the worst of it. I had hoped, in the private way that you hope for things you know are irrational, that 4 years would have changed him enough to make him manageable, softer, perhaps, older in ways that diminished rather than deepened. Instead, he was exactly what he had always been, just more distilled, the patience more absolute, the stillness more complete, the dark eyes holding that particular quality of focused attention that had made me fall in love with him, and then, later, run from him as fast and as far as I could get. "Let go of my wrist," I said. He did. Immediately, without hesitation, which was somehow worse than if he'd held on. "Sit down," he said again. Not a command this time. Something quieter than that. "I'm working." "Mara. My name is Elena." I said it clearly, evenly, the way I'd practiced in mirrors. "I don't know who you're looking for, but I've worked this route for 2 years and I can assure you, the route changed 8 months ago," he said. "Dublin to New York. Before that, you were on the London to Lisbon route. Before that, 18 months in Frankfurt." A pause. "You're good at moving. You always were." The cabin hummed. Someone in the rear laughed at something. The ordinary world continued its ordinary business 30,000 feet below us. "What do you want?" I asked, and the performance dropped out of my voice because there was no longer any point in it. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a loosening of the outermost layer of control. "The way a door opens an inch without committing to open further. To look at you," he said. "For a moment, that's all." It was such a specific and disarming answer that I stood there with the wet napkin in my hand and didn't say anything for 3 full seconds. "I have a job to do," I finally said. "I know. Do it. I'm not going anywhere." The implicit meaning of that, "and neither are you, not for another 6 hours," settled over me like the change in pressure before a storm. I walked back to the galley. Carla gave me a questioning look that I deflected with the seamless ease of long practice, taking fresh napkins, a small bottle of sparkling water, moving back through the motions of the job. The remaining hours of the flight rearranged themselves in my mind into a new geometry entirely. He didn't call me over again. He ate the meal that was served, spoke twice in low tones on one of his phones, received a visit from the man in 2C that lasted approximately 45 seconds and involved no audible exchange of words. He read from a leather-bound document folder. He was, to every observable measure, a businessman on a transatlantic flight. But every time I moved through the forward cabin, I felt his eyes find me the way you feel sunlight find skin, immediate, warm, and impossible to ignore regardless of where you were looking. Once, coming back from the forward lavatory check, I caught him fully watching me, making no effort to disguise it, and the expression on his face was one I hadn't seen since the early months of our marriage, before everything went wrong, before I understood what his work truly meant, before the fear had grown larger than the love, before the night I'd packed one bag in absolute silence while he slept, and walked out of a life that had been slowly suffocating me. He looked, in that unguarded moment, like a man who had found something he'd given up expecting to find. It terrified me more than anger would have. We landed at JFK at 6:14 in the morning, the New York skyline emerging from gray dawn in that particular way it had, announcing itself without apology. I stood at the forward door as passengers deplaned, doing what I always did, thanking people, smiling, holding the space between the aircraft and the world with professional warmth. He was the last to leave business class. He stood, straightened his jacket with one small precise gesture, and picked up the leather document folder. The security men were already in the jetway. He walked toward me with that unhurried stride, and I held my position, chin level, hands clasped. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Cedar and something darker, something I had no name for except that it had lived in my memory for 4 years without fading. "You look well," he said. "Thank you for flying with us," I said. A pause. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, plain, cream-colored, a phone number and nothing else, and set it on the narrow ledge beside the door without touching my hand. "I'm in New York for 3 days," he said. I said nothing. "The choice of whether to disappear again is yours," he said, with a quietness that made it sound almost like a kindness, "but I want you to know that I found you once." Another pause. "I'll find you again." He walked off the aircraft. I stood at the door for the remaining deplaning, the card sitting in my peripheral vision like a small, patient fire, and I thought about what I knew of Luca Vitano, which was considerable, and what I knew of myself after 4 years of running, which was also considerable, and I tried to determine which of those two things was stronger. By the time the cabin was empty, I still didn't have an answer. But I had picked up the card. Dublin felt different when I returned to it. That was the irrational thing. The city hadn't changed. The streets were the same wet gray they always were in November. The coffee shop below my apartment still burned its first batch of morning espresso at precisely 7:15, the smell drifting up through my kitchen window with faithful consistency. Nothing had changed. But I moved through my own life for the following week the way you move through a house after a break-in, touching familiar things and finding them subtly wrong, the ordinary rendered suspicious by the knowledge that safety had already been breached once. I had not called the number on the card. I had also not thrown the card away. It sat in the inner pocket of my winter coat, which I was aware was not a neutral choice. I could have left it on the aircraft. I could have dropped it in the JFK terminal bin between the jetway and passport control. Instead, it traveled back across the Atlantic with me, pressed against my ribs for 7 hours, and now lived in my coat pocket with the particular weight of something unresolved. I went back to work. Dublin to Frankfurt, Frankfurt to Rome, Rome back to Dublin. The routes I could do in my sleep, the cities I knew by their airport architecture and their particular quality of morning light through terminal glass. I was good at my job. I had made myself good at it deliberately, the way I had made myself good at everything since Palermo, through the simple discipline of needing to be. On the 6th day, my phone rang with an unknown Italian number. I stared at it through 4 rings, standing in my kitchen in bare feet with a cup of tea going cold in my hand. Then I answered, because not answering was its own kind of decision, and I was tired of making decisions by avoidance. "You didn't call," Luca said. "I didn't say I would." A pause. In the background I could hear the faint ambient sound of a room, a quiet one, probably a hotel, the particular acoustic quality of expensive soundproofing. "How are you?" he asked. The question was so ordinary that it took me a moment to process it. "Why are you calling me?" "Because you have a Dublin number now, and I have always been thorough," he said, and something in the measured way he said it told me that this was an understatement of considerable magnitude. And because I wanted to hear your voice without 30,000 feet of altitude and a Navy uniform between us, I set down my tea, moved to the window. The street below was empty except for a man walking a dog in the rain, both of them looking equally resigned to it. Luca. I tried to make his name sound like a boundary. Whatever you're thinking, I want to meet. In person. Somewhere of your choosing. Somewhere you feel safe. I won't bring anyone. You always bring someone. Then I'll bring one person. Marco. You know Marco. I did know Marco. I had known Marco for the 2 years of our marriage. Quiet, loyal, the kind of permanent fixture in Luca's life that I'd stopped registering as security and started registering as furniture. The comparison was unfair to Marco, who had once driven me to a hospital at 2 a.m. without question or judgment when I'd thought I was having an allergic reaction to something I'd eaten, and had waited 4 hours in a plastic chair to drive me home again. What is there to talk about? I asked. Everything, he said, and nothing if you prefer. I just want to sit across from you in daylight and have a conversation that doesn't involve turbulence. Despite everything, something small and treacherous moved through my chest at the phrasing. I pressed it flat. One meeting, I said. Public place. I choose where. Of course. And when I leave, you don't follow me. A pause that lasted precisely long enough to tell me he was considering how honest to be. I won't follow you myself, he said. It wasn't the reassurance I'd asked for, and we both knew it, and the fact that he didn't pretend otherwise was, against all reasonable judgment, the thing that made me say yes. I chose a coffee shop in the Temple Bar area, busy enough on a Saturday afternoon that we would be 2 people among many, the surrounding noise providing a kind of privacy that silence couldn't. I arrived 15 minutes early, took a corner table with sightlines to both the entrance and the side door, and ordered an Americano I had no intention of drinking. He arrived exactly on time. Marco stayed near the entrance, a large, quiet presence in a dark coat, and Luca crossed the coffee shop with that particular walk, measured, unhurried, aware of every person in the room without appearing to look at any of them. He wore a dark wool coat, no tie, and he looked so precisely like himself that something in my chest did something I would have preferred it not to do. He sat down across from me. We looked at each other for a moment without speaking, and it was the strangest feeling, like reading a book you'd loved and then put down for years, the familiarity and the distance existing simultaneously. You cut your hair, he said. 4 years ago. It suits you. He said it simply, without performance, and somehow that was worse than if he'd been effusive about it. The waiter came. Luca ordered espresso without looking at the menu. Some things apparently didn't change across 4 years, and an ocean. You've been looking for me, I said, because I needed to establish it plainly between us, rather than let it remain the enormous unspoken thing it currently was. Yes. Since when? He wrapped both hands around the small cup the waiter had brought with quiet efficiency. Since about 6 weeks after you left, he said. I know what you're thinking, that it took me 6 weeks to notice. It didn't. It took me 6 weeks to accept that you had actually gone and weren't coming back, and to start looking in ways that didn't involve standing in our apartment waiting for you to walk through the door. The image hit me harder than I expected. I had imagined many versions of Luca's response to my disappearance. Anger, relief, the swift, cold pivot to practical matters. I had not imagined him standing in a room waiting. Why did you keep looking? I asked. We were divorced. The papers were filed. I made sure of that. Yes, from a law office in Geneva through a proxy. A small pause. I know you were thorough. I know you planned it carefully. I've had 4 years to understand exactly how carefully. Something moved through his expression, difficult to name. You were that afraid of me. It wasn't a question. I was afraid of your life, I said, which was the most honest thing I had said to him in a very long time. He absorbed this quietly. Outside, the Dublin rain was doing what Dublin rain did, settling in for a long, committed stay. The coffee shop windows had begun to fog faintly at the edges. I never hurt you, he said, not defensively, just as a fact he needed to place on the table between us. No, I agreed. You never hurt me. A pause. But I watched you make decisions, Luca. I lived inside what those decisions meant. I knew what happened to people who were in your way, or who betrayed your trust, and I knew that I was one conversation, one moment of inconvenience, one wrong move away from being someone who had to be managed. You were my wife, he said, and the way he said it, low, with a weight that seemed to come from somewhere deep and unperformed, made the words sound like something more than a legal designation. I was your wife who knew too much and had no power, I said. Those are not comfortable things to be in your world. Silence. He looked at his espresso. A muscle moved in his jaw, almost imperceptible. I never wanted you to feel powerless, he said. I know that. And I did know it. That was the terrible complexity of the situation. Had always been. He hadn't wanted it. It had simply been the inevitable architecture of what he was. That didn't make it less true. He looked up at me then, and the expression on his face was one I hadn't seen before, or perhaps one I hadn't allowed myself to see when I was living inside it. Too busy monitoring my own survival to read his. I've changed some things, he said quietly. Luca, I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking for anything. His voice was steady, careful. I just need you to know that finding you, sitting here, is the first time in 4 years that I've felt like something in the world was where it was supposed to be. The rain pressed against the windows. The coffee shop moved around us with its cheerful, ordinary noise, and I sat with the most dangerous man I had ever loved and felt. Despite every reasonable and well-earned instinct I possessed, something in me leaned toward the warmth of him the way a cold thing leans toward fire. I did not lean forward, but I did not leave. Not yet. The meeting in Temple Bar lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the coffee shop wall with the peripheral awareness of someone who has learned to track exits and elapse time the way other people track weather, automatically, without conscious effort, as a basic condition of feeling safe. 2 hours and 40 minutes of conversation that moved through careful, neutral territory at first. Dublin, the flight routes I worked, the particular quality of transatlantic fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to fully resolve. And then, gradually, the way water finds lower ground, toward the things that actually mattered. He told me his mother had died 18 months ago, a stroke, fast and without prolonged suffering, which was, he said with the particular restraint of a man who didn't discuss grief directly, a mercy. I had liked his mother, a small, precise woman who had seen through me completely from the first meeting and approved of me anyway, which I had always found both flattering and slightly unnerving. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it without complication. He nodded once and moved on, because that was how he handled things that hurt. I told him almost nothing about my own 4 years. He didn't push. That restraint cost him something. I could see it in the careful way he held himself, the discipline it required not to ask every question that was clearly assembled and waiting behind his eyes, and the fact that he paid that cost without complaint did something inconvenient to my perception of the situation. When I stood to leave, he stood as well, immediately, and didn't reach for me. Thank you, he said. For coming. Don't read too much into it, I said. I won't. A pause. Will you have dinner with me tomorrow? No. He nodded, as though this was a reasonable answer that he was filing away rather than accepting. The week after, then, he said. I looked at him for a moment. You're not going back to Italy. I have business in Dublin, he said, pleasantly, in a tone that made it entirely clear that the business in Dublin had a name and was currently putting on her coat. I should have been angry. I assessed the anger, looking for it, and found something more complicated underneath. A reluctant, deeply inconvenient recognition that his refusal to pretend otherwise was, in its way, a form of respect. He wasn't manufacturing reasons. He was simply telling me the truth and allowing me to do with it what I chose. I'll think about it, I said. I left. Marco held the door. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist, and I walked the wet Dublin streets back toward my apartment with my hands in my coat pockets, fingers closing around that cream-colored card, and tried very hard to feel only the things that were useful. He stayed in Dublin for 3 weeks. I learned this the way I learned most things about the situation, incrementally, through small, accumulating evidence rather than direct disclosure. The second meeting happened at a restaurant I'd suggested, small and unassuming, the kind of place where the tables were close together, and the noise level precluded private conversations, which I had selected deliberately. He arrived with Marco and a second man I didn't recognize who took a table near the door and ate his meal with the particular focused efficiency of someone performing a function, rather than enjoying a dinner. We talked for 3 hours. I told him more than I'd intended. Not the details of the running, not the mechanics of the new identity, but the texture of the years. The loneliness of the first months, the strange liberation of anonymity. The way I had learned to make a life out of motion, to find something that resembled home in the rhythm of departure and arrival. He listened the way he always had, completely, with a quality of attention that made you feel, for the duration of speaking, like the most important thing in his world. It had seduced me at 26. At 32, knowing what I knew, it still reached something in me that apparently had not received the message about being careful. "You've been alone," he said at a pause. "I've been free," I corrected. "Those aren't opposites," he said. "But they're not synonyms either." I didn't answer, because he was right, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of acknowledging it. By the third meeting, a walk along the canal on a cold Tuesday afternoon, which I had suggested because open air and the ability to simply keep walking felt safer than enclosed spaces. Something between us had shifted into a register I hadn't planned for. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, which was a different and more complicated currency, but something resembling honesty. The particular relief of speaking to someone who already knew the worst of what you were, and had continued anyway. It was on this walk that the situation clarified itself in a way I hadn't anticipated. We had paused near one of the canal locks, watching the cold green water, when a man appeared on the path behind us. Not one of Luca's. I knew his people by now with the instinct of old familiarity, moving with a purposeful quality that registered in my body before my mind caught up. Luca registered it at precisely the same moment. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. Luca's hand was on my arm, moving me behind him with a firm, seamless motion that brooked no discussion. Marco materialized from somewhere I hadn't tracked him, placing himself between us and the approaching man, and the second security presence. The one I'd started privately calling the Shadow because he was always there and never visible, stepped into the path in a way that stopped it entirely without any discernible physical confrontation. The man turned out to be a tourist who was lost and wanted directions to the nearest Luas stop, which Marco provided in helpful and complete English, while I stood behind Luca's shoulder with my heart doing something dramatic against my ribs. After the tourist wandered off, Luca turned to look at me. "I'm sorry," he said. Reflex. "I noticed," I said, "but what I was actually noticing, what I carried home that evening and sat with in my kitchen for a long time, was the feeling of those 4 seconds. The absolute certainty with which he had moved me out of potential harm, the way his body had positioned itself between me and an unknown variable without hesitation, without calculation, as a pure and apparently involuntary response. I had spent 4 years believing that his world made me less safe. Standing behind his shoulder on that canal path, I had felt, for 4 complicated and deeply unwelcome seconds, the opposite. It was the most dangerous realization I'd had yet. The call came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the flight. I was home, marking a roster change on my work calendar, when my phone rang. Not Luca's number. Not any number I recognized. I answered with caution. "You need to be careful." A woman's voice, Italian accent, controlled but carrying an edge of urgency underneath. "He won't tell you himself because he doesn't think you need to know, but there are people watching you who are not his." "Who is this?" "Someone who knew you in Palermo, someone who is still there." A pause. "His position has been challenged. There is a man, Ferretti, who believes that finding you, caring about you, makes Luca weak. Ferretti has resources and he is not patient." Another pause. "He knows where you live, Elena. He knew before Luca did." The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, and the carefully constructed life around me. The modest apartment, the clean name, The freedom I had built one deliberate brick at a time suddenly looked less like a sanctuary and more like what it had always actually been, a place someone had let me believe was hidden. I called the number on the cream card. He answered on the second ring. "I know," he said, before I could speak. His voice was calm in the way that meant the opposite of calm. "I found out an hour ago. Marco was already outside your building. You knew someone was watching me and you didn't—" "I found out an hour ago," he repeated, with a quiet emphasis that told me this was true, and that it had cost him something significant to be in the position of finding out rather than knowing. "I'm coming to you. Don't open the door for anyone until I'm there. I'll call when I'm outside. Luca, please," he said. Just that word, in a register I had never heard from him in 2 years of marriage, stripped of control, carrying something unguarded and urgent. "Please stay inside." I stayed inside. 20 minutes later, he called again, and when I opened the door, he was standing in my narrow Dublin hallway, looking at me with an expression that finally, after 4 years and 3 weeks and more careful distance than I had known I was capable of, dropped every layer of management he had ever worn in my presence. "You're all right," he said, as though confirming it for himself. "I'm all right," I said. He stepped inside, and I let him. And outside on the street, Marco stood in the rain like a fixed point. And somewhere in the organization of a man named Ferretti, something had begun that would force every unresolved thing between us into the open whether we were ready or not. Ferretti's move came 9 days later. In those 9 days, my apartment became something I didn't have a clean word for. Not a prison, because the door was never locked from the outside, and not entirely my own space either, because Luca was there every evening and sometimes in the mornings, and Marco was a permanent fixture in the building's small lobby in a way that the elderly woman on the ground floor had apparently decided to interpret as a very dedicated boyfriend situation, which she approved of warmly and vocally whenever I passed her door. I did not correct her. Luca and I existed in those 9 days in a careful, provisional intimacy, sharing meals that he ordered in because he didn't trust restaurants until they could be properly evaluated, talking late into the evenings with the particular freedom of people who have already survived the worst misunderstandings between them, and find, on the other side, that conversation comes easier than it did when everything was still at stake. He worked from my kitchen table in the mornings, phone calls in Italian conducted in low tones that I didn't strain to hear, documents reviewed with that focused precision I remembered from our marriage. The version of him that was, regardless of everything else, genuinely serious about the responsibilities he carried. Once, I came into the kitchen at midnight for water and found him asleep in the chair, his reading glasses, which were new, which meant 4 years had given him something after all, slightly crooked on his face, documents spread across the table. I stood in the doorway for a long moment looking at him, at the exhaustion visible in the unguarded lines of his face, at the man underneath the architecture of control, and felt something in my chest arrive at a conclusion that my mind was still resisting. I took a blanket from the closet and put it over him and went back to bed. In the morning, he didn't mention it, but when I came into the kitchen, he had made coffee, proper espresso, which meant he'd gone out early and acquired the necessary equipment, a development I chose not to examine too closely. And there was something in the way he looked at me over his cup that told me he understood exactly what the blanket had meant. Ferretti's move was not subtle. It came on a Wednesday morning when I was due at the airport for a Frankfurt rotation. Marco drove me. This had become the arrangement, non-negotiable from Luca's perspective, presented to me not as a command but as a request, stated with such quiet intensity that the distinction barely mattered. I had accepted it because I was not foolish enough to confuse pride with good judgment. We were 4 minutes from the airport when the car behind us, a dark sedan that Marco had apparently been tracking for longer than he'd mentioned, accelerated and forced us toward the curb in a way that was unmistakably deliberate. Marco handled it with a professional competence that was genuinely impressive, keeping the vehicle controlled, and I had my phone out before we'd fully stopped, calling Luca before Marco had even said a word, because 4 years of careful survival had given me certain reflexes. Luca answered in one ring. "I know. Don't get out of the car." His voice was contained, precise. "Marco knows what to do. I'm 12 minutes away." He was there in 9. What followed involved a level of organized, purposeful activity that I observed from the back seat of the car, with the strange calm that sometimes arrives in the center of situations that are too large for ordinary fear. Phone calls, the appearance of 2 additional vehicles, Marco speaking quietly into his earpiece while watching the street with absolute attention. Luca came to my window, crouched down to my level, which I registered as a deliberate choice, making himself smaller, meeting me where I was. "You're not hurt," he said. "I'm not hurt." His eyes moved over my face with an attention that had nothing professional about it. Then he reached through the open window and took my hand. Not urgently, not dramatically, with the same careful deliberateness he'd been applying to everything since Dublin, and held it for a moment. "This ends today," he said. I won't detail what happened with Ferretti. Partly because I wasn't present for it, and partly because the version of myself I had built over 4 years, the one who valued clean hands and clear distances, needed not to be present for it. What I know is that by evening the threat was resolved in the permanent way that threats in Luca's world were resolved, and that the particular fear I had carried for 9 days lifted with a completeness that told me it was genuinely gone. Luca came back to my apartment at 10 o'clock that night. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical, the tiredness of a man who has done what his world required and carries the weight of it without complaint, and without pretending it weighs nothing. I had made dinner. Real dinner, not ordered in, pasta, the simple Roman way he'd taught me in the kitchen of the Palermo house in the first year of our marriage, before everything became complicated. It was a deliberate thing, that dinner. A statement I couldn't quite make in words. He sat down across from me and looked at the table and then at me, and for once the layers of control were simply not there, not managed away, not disciplined into submission, just genuinely absent, the way a coat comes off when you're finally home. "Mara," he said. "Elena," I said quietly. "I need to stay Elena. The name, the life. I've built something real here. I need you to understand that." He nodded slowly. "Elena, then." He tried it. "It suits you. Both of you. Whoever you've become." "I've become someone who isn't afraid," I said. "I need that to stay true. I know." He looked at his hands on the table, then back at me. "I've spent 4 years understanding what I built that fear into, what I allowed to grow around you without seeing it clearly." A pause. "I'm not asking to go back to what we were. That version of things wasn't right for you. I can see that now in ways I couldn't then." "What are you asking for?" I said. "Something different. Something built differently from the beginning, with you having every exit clearly marked and every door unlocked." He held my gaze with a steadiness that I recognized as costing him. Vulnerability was not a currency he spent easily. "I'm asking if that's something you'd be willing to try to build." The Dublin night pressed against the windows. Somewhere below, Marco was probably standing in the rain with his quiet, faithful competence. The pasta was going cold, and neither of us was eating it. I thought about 4 years of motion. The cities and airports and recycled air, the careful anonymity, the freedom that had been real and necessary, and that had also, if I was honest in the way that this moment seemed to require, been a different kind of cage, one I'd built myself for good reasons, but a cage nonetheless. I thought about a canal path and 4 seconds of his body between me and an unknown danger, a blanket over his shoulders at midnight, coffee made before I woke, a hand through a car window, steady and unhurried, meeting me exactly where I was. I thought about who I was at 32, not the frightened woman who had packed a single bag in silence, and not the ghost of Elena Marsh either, but someone forged from both, harder and clearer, and more certain of her own edges than she had ever been. "I'm not moving back to Italy," I said. "I know, I keep my job, my name, my apartment, whatever you need. And if I decide at any point that it's not working, if I feel that fear come back, I leave, without negotiation, and you accept that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, on the condition that you tell me first. Give me the chance to understand what I've done wrong before you go." A pause. That's all I needed, 4 years ago. The chance to understand. It was such a reasonable and painful thing to say that something behind my ribs ached with the truth of it. "That's fair," I said. He exhaled. Slow, controlled, but carrying the release of something long held. And then he reached across the table and picked up his fork and served himself pasta, and looked at me with something that on any other man I would simply have called happiness, but on Luca carried the particular quality of a man who has found, against considerable odds, exactly the thing he had stopped believing he deserved. I picked up my own fork. We ate dinner in my Dublin kitchen with the rain on the windows and Marco downstairs, and the whole complicated truth of what we were to each other sitting openly on the table between us. Not as a weight, not as a wound, but as something that had finally been allowed to simply be what it was. In the months that followed, we built what he described, carefully, imperfectly, with genuine difficulty and genuine honesty in roughly equal measure. He divided his time between Dublin and Italy, arriving in a car that Marco drove, and leaving the door of my life always, demonstrably, unlocked. The fear did not come back, not because the complexity of his world disappeared, but because I was no longer inside it as a person without power, without voice, without the ability to leave. I had all three. The having of them changed everything. I kept flying. Transatlantic routes, the recycled air, and the altitude, and the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of moving through clouds at speed. I loved it still, loved the life I'd built inside it, and it remained mine in the complete way that things are yours when you've chosen them freely, rather than arrived at them by necessity. My sister came to Dublin the following spring. Sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen with new plants on the windowsill and Luca's espresso equipment on the counter, and looked at me for a long time before saying anything. "You look like yourself," she finally said. "The self I was worried we'd lost." "I think I found her somewhere over the Atlantic," I said. 30,000 feet up of all places. She laughed. Then she looked at Luca's jacket on the hook by the door, and at the 2 coffee cups already on the table, and raised an eyebrow. "He found you first," she said. "He did," I agreed, "but I decided to stay. That part was mine." And it was. After everything, the running and the hiding and the finding, the fear and the distance, and the slow, careful work of building trust from wreckage, the decision to remain was mine, made freely by a woman who knew her own exits and had chosen not to take them. That, in the end, was the only version of the story worth telling.